Sir, would you give us your name, please?
Charles Best.
Mr. Best, what is your business or occupation?
I am an insurance agent.
What did you do to prepare for your deposition?
Not really a lot. Although I am the agent of record regarding your client, I have never met or spoke to him, to the best of my knowledge.
Mr. Best, over the last 10 years, how many condo policies would you estimate that you've written?
I would estimate probably this one and maybe one more and maybe not one more.
How long had the Wekars been insured with your agency prior to the time that this policy was written?
I can't tell you specifically.
Did the Wekars have a mortgage on their condominium?
I'm not sure.
Mr. Best, have you ever seen the governing documents for the condominium complex where the Wekars live?
No, sir.
Did either you or anyone at your agency, to your knowledge, request those documents before the policy was written?
No, not that I know of.
Do you know whether the roof was covered in this case by the association's insurance?
I really don't know.
Have you seen the declarations page for the policy that was issued by your agency?
I have not. Now, when you say, have you seen it, I have seen it just like I saw you earlier today. I would assume that was a declaration page. I've seen it like that. I think that is a declaration page. I call it a deck page. But as far as to sit down and study it, no, sir, I have not.
Okay. What about the coverages? Prior to today, had you ever looked at the coverages on the deck page?
Other than $80,000, no. Not even the premium.
How much was the condo actually worth in this case? Do you know that?
I have no idea.
Do you know how much the insured paid for the condo?
I have no idea.
And I believe you told me earlier that you don't know how Ms. Tipton came up with $80,000 on the personal property coverage. Is that true?
Not completely, I do not.
Does the insured fill out an application?
The insured would fill out an application.
Did the insured fill out an application in this case?
I have no idea.
Have you ever seen an application that was filled out by the insured in this case?
I have not.
Have you looked for one?
Have not.
What does the underwriting department do with the information that you provide to it?
You really want the truth?
Yes, please.
I'm not really sure.
Um,
And that is the truth. It's Al Gore's black box.
At the time that the Wekars had their homeowners coverage with your agency, do you know how much personal property coverage they had at that point?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you know if it was more or less than the amount of personal property coverage they had when they bought the policy that's at issue in this case?
I have no idea.
You've not gone back to investigate that to see whether it was more or less or the same?
No, sir.
Mr. Best, let's look back at Plaintiff's Exhibit number 1 for a moment, and I want to direct your attention to the personal property limit. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
$80,000, do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Do you know if that number is more or less than the Wekars actually paid for their condominium unit?
I do not know.
Do you have an opinion about whether $80,000 for personal property coverage was too much or too little for the Wekars?
I really do not.
Do you know whether the amount of coverage that's reflected in Plaintiff's Exhibit number 1 is the same as the amount of coverage that the Wekars requested from your agency?
Objective form.
I don't know.
Mr. Best, has anyone ever told you that the amount of coverage that the Wekars requested from your agency was different than the amount that's reflected on the declarations page?
No.
Do you know someone named Elizabeth Propst?
No. Other than That's an unusual last name. That could have been somebody in a movie to me, or it could have been somebody from our company, or somebody that works for you.
Do you know someone named Chet Ames?
Pardon me?
Do you know someone named Chet Ames? A-M-E-S?
That rings no bells.
Mr. Best, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? You have told me now what Ms. Tipton and Ms. Harder do, and it sounds like they take care of a lot of the details of actually writing the business. How do you fit in as far as the
How do I fit
workflow
in?
in your agency?
They might ask you the same thing, but how is that pertinent to this lawsuit?
Sir, would you give us your name, please?
Chet Ames,
Where are you employed today?
Farmers Insurance Exchange.
Mr. Ames, what is your understanding of the dispute between the insureds in this case and farmers?
My understanding is that they have incurred damages that they believe are covered or should be covered. And really I guess the argument in this is whether or not they had building coverages to cover those damages or not.
Do you know why Mr. Weker's policy was written with $80,000 worth of contents coverage?
I do not know why.
Do you know whether Mr. Weker and his wife actually own $80,000 worth of personal property?
I don't know.
Did you or anyone else at Farmers, to your knowledge, investigate whether or not Mr. and Mrs. Weker actually owned $80,000 worth of contents?
I'm not sure. I did not.
And to your you don't know of anyone at Farmers who investigated that either, is that true?
Correct.
Mr. Ames, have you ever met the insured in this case?
No.
Have you ever met his wife?
No.
Have you been to their property?
No.
Have you ever spoken to either of the insureds?
No.
Mr. Ames, do you know how much contents coverage the insureds in this case had on their previous residence?
No.
Did you investigate that issue?
No.
To your knowledge, did anyone at Farmers investigate that issue?
No.
Do you know the name of the agent who wrote the policy?
Charles Best.
Have you ever spoken with Mr. Best about this issue?
I don't believe I've spoken with Mr. Best. I have spoken with one of his representatives from his office, and I can't recall her name offhand.
Did you obtain either a written or a recorded statement from the person whose name you cannot remember in the agent's office?
No.
During the time that you spent at the University of Farmers, were you instructed on how to take a recorded statement from a witness?
No, I don't believe so.
I take it that obtaining recorded statements from people is not something you do with any frequency. Is that true?
That's correct.
Mr. Ames, during your involvement with this claim, did you ever ask for a legal opinion from a lawyer concerning whether this claim should be paid or not?
No.
Did you ever recommend to anyone at Farmers that Farmers obtain such an opinion?
No.
Did you ever recommend to anyone at Farmers that Farmers file a declaratory judgment action concerning this claim?
No.
Do you even know what that is?
No.
I'm certain that you can't give us the exact number, but could you give us a ballpark estimate of the number of water claims that you've worked on in your career at Farmers?
As a supervisor and a claims representative, 500 to 1,000.
Is it common or uncommon that mold would develop from a water loss if the leak isn't corrected and it just continues for months or years?
It would be common that mold would grow, yes.
Do you have any reason to disbelieve the insured's representation and the proof of loss that was submitted to Farmers that there is mold in the unit?
No.
Mr. Ames, are you familiar with the term reformation?
Yes.
Tell me what you understand that term to mean.
In regards to
Insurance, not religion.
Okay. Reformation would be whenever you change the policy that's enforced to be something else, or some aspect of the policy.
Do you understand that the insured is asking farmers to reform the policy in this
Yes.
case?
Yes.
Whose decision at Farmers was it that the policy would not be reformed? Was that you or someone else?
Yeah, that was Elizabeth Propst and her supervisor.
Ma'am, would you give us your name, please?
Elizabeth Propst,
Where are you employed today?
Farmers Insurance Exchange.
What were your job responsibilities as a property coverage adjuster?
As a property coverage adjuster, we investigated if there was applicable coverage for the loss, that being if the policy was in force or out of force, or if we had any referrals from the field adjuster when somebody was asserting a coverage that was different from what was in their policy.
The type of investigation that you conducted on the claim that we're here to talk about today, which type of investigation was that?
An assertion investigation, the policy was active.
Back in the January of 2009 timeframe when this claim was referred to you, how long had you been a property coverage adjuster at that point in time?
I started actually taking claims in '07, so November of '07-ish, so about a year and 2 months.
And could you give me just a ballpark estimate of how many assertion claims that you had handled up to that point in
Oh,
time? We'll be
geez.
talking about dozens or hundreds or thousands?
Definitely hundreds. I would say I probably got, on average, 8 claims a day, and probably 3 to 4 of them would be assertions. And without a calculator, that's the best I can do.
Out of those many, many claims, assertion claims that you had looked at, how many of those, just as a percentage, involved a claim where the insured and the agent were disputing what the coverage actually was?
Probably, it's more common for an insured to assert an agent error than an underwriting error. So probably 70%.
So 70% of the assertion claims that you would have handled up to that point in time would have involved some issue of a dispute between the agent and the insured regarding the coverage. Is that what you're
Right,
saying?
right. Or just what our systems were showing versus what the insured was stating they should have. And then them asserting it was an error on the agent side as opposed to the underwriting side.
Of those 70% of the assertion claims that you looked at, how frequently did it turn out that the insured was correct in the assertion that the insured was making?
A fair amount of times. Maybe half. I don't really know.
Reformation mean? What is your understanding of that term?
That we're going to change something.
You understood that the insured in this case, the weaker case, was requesting that the policy be reformed. Is that true?
Yes.
And you determined that farmers would not reform the policy. Is that true?
Yes.
How much contents coverage did the agent write the policy for?
$80,000.
And where did that amount come from?
I don't know.
So, did you investigate where the $80,000 came from, how the agent actually came up with that amount?
No.
On a condominium policy, do you know how the agent typically arrives at the amount of the contents coverage?
No.
Do you know whether or not the insured in this case actually owns $80,000 worth of contents?
I don't know.
Did you investigate that?
No.
Did you investigate how much money the insured paid for the condominium?
No.
During your work on this file, did you investigate how long the insured had been with Farmers prior to this particular dispute?
No.
Did you investigate whether the insured had any prior coverage with Farmers prior to taking out this particular policy?
No.
Have you ever met Mr. or Mrs. Wekar?
No.
I know they submitted a written statement to you. Have you ever spoken with them?
No.
Have you ever been to see the property that's the subject of this dispute?
No.
Did you travel to Oklahoma to meet anyone in the agent's office in person?
No.
Do you know whether or not the insured filled out an application?
No.
Ma'am, did you seek a legal opinion from anyone prior to recommending that this claim be denied?
No.
Did you consider filing a declaratory judgment action prior to recommending that the claim be denied?
I don't know what that is, so no.
Ma'am, looking back on things, is there anything that you believe that you should have done differently as far as your investigation of this claim?
I'm pretty satisfied with the way that I handled the claim.
If you had it to do all over again, you wouldn't do anything differently?
I don't think so.
None of your superiors at Farmers have ever expressed any dissatisfaction with the way that you handled this claim, is that true?
That is true.
In fact, even after the filing of this lawsuit, no one at Farmers has ever expressed any dissatisfaction or displeasure with the way that you handled this claim, is that true?
Yes.
Do you feel like you owe the insured an apology for any reason?
No.
Do you feel like your company owes the insured an apology for any reason?
Not that I would know of. No, they're not. No.
Ma'am, would you give us your name, please?
Andrea Harder,
Where are you employed today, ma'am?
for Charles Best Agency Farmers Insurance.
What do you do there?
I'm a customer service rep.
How long have you been employed at the agency?
At his agency, 12 years.
Were you the person at the agency that wrote this policy, or was that someone else?
It was someone else.
Do you know who wrote the policy?
I believe it was Joyce Timpson.
You were not actually involved in writing the policy, is that true?
True.
Your first contact with either Mr. or Mrs. Wekar occurred after the policy had already been written, is that true?
True.
And you've never spoken to whoever it was that actually did write the policy about what conversations they may have had with either Mr. Wekar or Mrs. Wekar, is that true?
That's true.
Prior to August 28th of 2006, you had no idea that a condo policy had even been written for the Wekars, is that
That's true.
Do you know what the Wekars paid for their condominium?
No.
Do you know how whoever wrote this policy arrived at the $80,000 personal property limit?
No.
And so we really have no way of knowing whether Ms. Tipton may have said something mistakenly to the Wekars about the coverage because nobody has ever asked her that, and there's no record of what she said to the Wekars. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yes.
Did you tell the person that spoke with you on December 31st, 2008, that you were not involved in writing the policy?
They didn't ask. So no, I didn't, because they didn't ask.
Would it be fair to say that you don't know what Mr. Wekar was told when the policy was issued because you were not involved in that process?
Yes, that's fair.
Let's look back at exhibit number 1, which was the computer notes. Are there any computer notes in exhibit number 1 that pertain to the writing of the policy?
No.
All right, and just to make sure that I'm clear, I'm asking, regardless of the author of the note, whether it be you or Ms. Tipton or someone else, there are no notes in the computer notes in Exhibit Number 1 that pertain to the actual writing of the policy. Is that true?
I do not see any here.
Back at the time that this policy was issued, what was the practice in the agency as far as putting notes of telephone conversations into the computer?
The practice was to put comments in after telephone conversations, to make comments.
Sure. And was the practice to memorialize all of the telephone conversations that you would have with a customer, or only certain telephone conversations?
All of them.
So if Ms. Tipton had spoken with either Mr. Wekar or Mrs. Wekar prior to the policy being issued, that conversation should have been memorialized in the computer notes if the policies and procedures in the office had been followed. Is that true?
True.
How long had Mr. Wekar and Mrs. Wekar been customers at the Charles Best Agency? Do you know that?
No, I do not know.
Do you know when they first became customers of the agency?
No.
Do you know whether they had any insurance coverage written by the agency that you worked for prior to the condominium policy that was written that's reflected in Exhibit Number 2 to your deposition?
No, I don't know.
In the 12 years that you've worked for the Charles Best Agency, have you ever written a condo policy like the one that is involved in this case?
We do not write very many, very, very few. And I do not remember, to be honest, if we've written, we may have one or two, but I mean, in our area, we just don't write that many.
Well, let me ask it this way. Do you have a recollection of ever having written a condo policy during the 12 years that you've worked at the Charles Best Agency? I'm talking about you personally.
I don't remember it if I have. That doesn't mean I haven't, but I can't tell you. I can't think of one, but surely in 12 years I've done one, but I don't know.
All right. If you have, you don't recall it right now. Is that true?
That's true.
How would the insured know what coverage was being provided in a policy at the time that it's written, other than what they learned from whoever it was they talked to at the agency?
That's how they would know. I mean, you trust your agent. That's the reason you go to that agent.
Right. During the time that you've worked at the Charles Best Agency, have you received any instructions from anyone on anything that you should tell the insured about a condo policy?
Since I've worked there?
Yes.
No.
At your agency, do you have any type of written information that provides you with a summary of what is covered and what isn't covered on the various policies?
Not, I'm sure there's some somewhere, but not that we really use.
Have you ever read completely through a condominium policy with farmers before?
No.
Have you ever read any part of a condo policy before?
No.
Have you ever even seen one?
The actual policy?
Yes, ma'am.
No, because it's mailed to the insured.
You would agree with me that the majority of the time, the principal source of information about what's covered in the policy and what isn't at the time that it's written is the information that the insured gets from the agent. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, yes.
Do you read the policy every time you get it?
No.
All right. And in your experience, would you agree with me that most people usually don't read the policy?
Object to the form.
Would you agree with that?
I agree with that.